First of all, I would like to apologize on behalf of my colleague, Carmen Toledano. Yeah. Because she was not feeling well and she had to go back to her hotel, although she's attending the conference and she would like to be here. First of all, thank you for attending this talk, especially after lunch. I know it is hard. And I would like to start by saying that I'm very glad, I'm delighted actually, that there are a significant number of lectures on public service interpreting in this conference, because I must say that when I started training public service interpreters 10 years ago, not many, but some conference interpreters did not take public service interpreting seriously. So it's very rewarding to see that things are changing very fast. I'm going to speak about differences and similarities between two modalities of remote interpreting, which is telephone interpreting and video-mediated interpreting. And I would like to lay the foundations for a joint training of these two modalities. I know that there are several terms to refer to video-mediated interpreting, for example, video conference interpreting. In this case, just for practical reasons, I will refer to it as video-mediated interpreting. These two modes of interpreting have been growing a lot in Spain. They have been more and more used in the past 10 years. Telephone interpreting started to be used in Spain in 2004, and now it is very common in settings such as hospitals, even police stations, schools, just to name but a few. And video-mediated interpreting is mainly used in court proceedings only, not in other settings, or at least much less used in other settings. Traditionally, telephone interpreting has been questioned for a number of reasons, and especially because of the lack of visual access on behalf of the interpreters. If you cannot see what you have to interpret, if you cannot see your users, the interpreter users, how can you render a quality interpretation? And obviously, that is an obstacle for interpreters that cannot be denied. The fact that we cannot see the users, that fact that we are not there with them, poses an obstacle for interpreters. However, what we would like to state here with this study is that there are two other factors that are very important and that pose even a more important obstacle for interpreters, for remote interpreters. And that is the absence of the interpreter, the fact that the interpreter is not present in the setting where the communication takes place, and also the use of technology. Both these factors are obviously inherent to remote interpreting, and they affect all forms or all aspects of communication when there is a remote interpretation. And especially, they hamper which is called coordination of talk. I will explain some of these concepts because I know many of you are acquainted with public service interpreting, but maybe some of you are not, so just in case I will explain that. As some of you know, Cecilia Vadensio established a division of roles for public service or dialogue interpreters in general, and so she says that dialogue interpreters have two main functions. One is translating the utterances, translating what is said from one language to another, and the other one is coordinating interaction. Because, as we all know, conversations, dialogues do not run smoothly all the time. People interrupt each other, overlap each other. They do not let the interpreter finish their interpretation, their rendition. So it is the interpreter who has to assign turns of talk so communication runs smoothly and in an effective manner. And of course, it is the interpreter who has to do that because she is the only person who understands both languages, so it's her role. We will support this study with the results of the Avidicus project, which I'm sure you know. It's a project, a European-funded project. I think it is funded by the Criminal Justice Program, if I'm not mistaken. And it deals with video-mediated interpreting in criminal proceedings. It's an amazing project, and its results are very interesting as well. Let's start with the definition of remote interpreting. Remote interpreting is a type of interpreting used in settings where some or all of the participants in conversation, that is, the interpreter and at least 2 users, are in different locations and connected through a technological device, which can be a telephone, in which case we're speaking about telephone interpreting, or a video conference system, in which case we're speaking about video-mediated interpreting. Obviously, I think it is quite obvious for all of us that remote interpreting is different from face-to-face interpreting. We have mentioned some of these differences, and I will explain some more in this presentation. So if it has distinctive features, it is only logical to think that being a remote interpreter requires specific skills that have to be developed through a specific training. In this training, interpreters will have to adapt coping strategies that they usually use in face-to-face interpreting, but they will also have to adopt and develop new specific skills. In this slide, you can see telephone interpreting's main features, which we will use to establish differences and similarities in opposition to video-mediated interpreting. Well, both modes of interpreting are obviously technology-mediated interpreting modes. There are nuances, of course. Video-mediated interpreting is more sophisticated, and it also implies more involvement on behalf of the interpreter. Usually, video-mediated interpreters, for example, in court proceedings, have to learn how to use the camera zoom, the volume of the equipment, so implication is bigger in this case. As for the interpreter's location, in both interpreting modes, the interpreter is physically separated from one or all of the users. And this creates a feeling of isolation in the interpreter, which is reported in many studies. I won't go in depth into this, but I think it's a very interesting concept. The interpreter feels this separation, and it feels that as an obstacle for an effective interpretation. The main difference is that, at least in Spain, telephone interpreters are usually alone, normally in their homes, interpreting, and also, therefore they are separated from the rest of the users, the rest of the participants in conversation. However, usually video-mediated interpreters are with one of the users, are in one of the settings where communication takes place. Imagine, for example, a criminal proceeding. Normally, for example, the interpreter might be with the witness in a certain location, and the rest of the participants, the judges, lawyers, are in another location in the court, maybe in another country even. A big difference between these two modes of interpreting is the access, the immediacy of access to an interpreter. Telephone interpreting is very, very immediate. It allows access to an interpreter in a matter of minutes or even sometimes seconds. It's very fast, and that is the main reason why it is so beneficial for the public administration and public services in Spain, for example. That is very good for public service providers, not so good for interpreters who have to work without context. That they just have to pick up the phone without knowing where the call comes from, which is very difficult. In the case of video-mediated interpretation, it is usually pre-booked, which theoretically allows the interpreter to prepare the assignment, although we all know here that that does not always happen, right? And the lack of access to visual information, the fact that the interpreters have a limited or just no image of what is happening is the main element I would like to comment here. This has been the main reason, as I said before, to question telephone interpreting's quality. If you cannot see it, how can you interpret it? It affects all aspects of this kind of interpretation, and as we said, especially coordination of talk, and especially and particularly turn-taking management. Of course, that is theoretically not the case in video-mediated interpreting. In fact, video, the main advantage of video is that it allows us to see the setting where communication takes place. But does it make the interpreter's life any easier at all? And the answer, I'm afraid, is no. How do interpreters manage turn-taking? When the interpretation takes place face-to-face, interpreters usually use paratextual elements, such as visual elements, such as gestures, hand movements, gaze, and also posture. So when we wish a speaker to stop speaking, we usually only have to look at him significantly, or we have to raise our hand, and that is usually enough to manage turns. In remote interpreting, both in telephone and video-mediated interpreting, that is very difficult. I would not say impossible, but very difficult. So the interpreters are forced to use verbal and vocal cues. Well, as you know, verbal means using words. Vocal means using also intonation, pauses, silences. In telephone interpreting, we cannot use hands, gestures, or gaze, those elements, just because we cannot see the user. So it's impossible. The problem with video-mediated interpreting, as we can see, for example, in the Avidicus results, is that, first of all, gaze. We cannot use gaze. We cannot look at the users and expect them to manage their turns like that, because the visual contact through a video, through a screen, is completely artificial. And I think every one of us has used, for example, Skype, and we know that if we want to create the illusion that we are looking at someone, we have to look at the camera. The problem is when we look at the camera, we do not look at the users or the other participants in conversation. If we look at them, we do not establish visual contact. So it is not possible to use gaze as a turn-taking management tool. In the case of hand-raising, movement, or postures, it really depends on the equipment, but it's quite difficult. The Avidicus results, for example, and also our experience in training, tell us that sometimes our hand is out of shot, so users cannot see it, or the zoom is not powerful enough. We cannot also manage turns with our facial gestures because maybe the zoom is not powerful so to capture them. Or sometimes users are not looking at the interpreter. The problem is that visual information is presented two-dimensionally. What does it mean? That the image, what we see, has height, has width, but has no depth. Imagine, for example, you're speaking to someone, even if you're not looking directly at that person, if that person raises a hand, you can perceive it. You can realize that the person is raising a hand. Can you picture what I'm saying? Yeah? But the problem is when we see somebody through a screen, you cannot do that. You cannot perceive gestures unless you are directly seeing them on the screen. So very difficult to manage turn-taking like that. Brown says that in an article where she states that an analysis of nonverbal behavior reveals that common nonverbal strategies used by interpreters to gain the floor, especially hand raising, often failed, either because the interpreter's hand was off-screen or because the primary interlocutors did not look towards the screen at the relevant moment. In face-to-face interpretation, peripheral vision would allow the primary interlocutors to notice hand raising, even without looking directly at the interpreter. So this is what I was saying, more or less. This is less likely in a video conference where visual information is presented two-dimensionally. So, quite concluding. The same happens when the interpreter has to interrupt communication and speaking with her own voice for a different number of reasons. For example, to clarify, repeat, or confirm information, to manage textual density, because the speaker is just speaking too long and giving too much information, or to manage unfinished renditions. Sometimes the interpreter is interrupted and cannot continue, or because there is overlapping speech, two people speaking at the same time. Or in the case of remote interpreting, maybe because the interpreter needs to interrupt to solve some technical problem. In remote interpreting, this also has to be done through verbal or vocal cues, which slows down communication. And that is, for example, something that telephone interpreting providers and trainers complain a lot about, that usually trainees, and anytime they need to interrupt, start by saying, excuse me, sorry, which when you repeat it a lot, it really slows down communication. But I think it's difficult to do it otherwise. Also, the command of prosodic elements becomes very useful. When trainees learn to identify, for example, a certain intonation that indicates that the utterance is going to finish, for example, or a breathing pattern that indicates that a person is going to start speaking, that is very useful. Sometimes when we're going to start speaking, we say, right? Sometimes when we are in a face-to-face conversation, we do not notice those elements, but when we interpret remotely, learning to identify them can become a very useful tool. So, in conclusion, as I said, remote interpreters need specific training. That seems to be clear. They cannot just be taken from face-to-face interpretation and just throw them into a remote interpretation without any preparation at all. And as I said, training, of course, should be focused on lack of visual access or limitations of visual access in the case of video-mediated interpreting, but that cannot be the main point. Also, the absence of the interpreter from the setting and the use of technology has to be addressed and demands the development of specific skills. And remote interpreters have to relearn to do certain things. They have to relearn to listen actively, to be able to identify these elements that can help them to manage, for example, interaction mainly. And also, remote interpreters should be taught to use, as I said, verbal and vocal strategies to interrupt or intervene anytime they need to. And that is all. Thank you very much.